The Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who had no children. They longed very much for a child, and when at last they had a little daughter, they were both delighted. And great celebrations took place. When the time came for the little princess to be christened, the king made a grand feast and invited all but one of the fairies in his kingdom to be godmothers. There happened to be 13 fairies in the kingdom, but because the king only had 12 gold plates, he had to leave one of them out. The 12 fairies that were invited came to the christening and presented the little princess with the best gifts in their possession. One gave her beauty, one gave her wisdom, another gave her grace, and another gave her goodness, until all but one of them had presented their offerings. Just as the last fairy was about to step forward and offer her gift, there came a tremendous knocking at the door. And before anybody could even get there to open it, the door was burst open, and in came the 13th fairy in a furious rage at not having been invited to the feast. When she saw all the gifts which the other fairies had presented to the child, she laughed and exclaimed, "A lot of good all this beauty and virtue and wealth will do to you, my pretty princess. You shall pay for the slight that your royal father has put upon me." Then, turning to the terrified king and queen, she said in a loud voice, "When the princess is 15 years old, she shall prick her finger on a spindle and die." After the wicked fairy said this, she flew away as noisily as she came in. The king and queen were in despair, and the courtiers stood aghast at the terrible disaster. Even the little baby princess began to cry as if she knew the fate in store for her. Then the 12th fairy stepped forward and said, "Do not be afraid. I have not yet given my gift. I cannot undo the wicked spell, but I can soften the evil. The princess, on her 15th birthday, shall still prick her finger on a spindle, but she shall not die from it. Instead, she shall fall asleep for 100 years. "But what comfort will that be to us?" cried the queen. "Long before the 100 years have passed, we shall be dead, and our darling child will be just as lost to us as if she were actually dead." "I can make that right too," explained the fairy. "When the princess falls asleep, you shall sleep too, and you shall awaken with her when the 100 years have passed." Despite this, the king still hoped to save his daughter from such a terrible misfortune. So he ordered all the spinning wheels in his kingdom to be burnt or destroyed, and made a law that no one was to use one. But all his care turned out to be useless. On her 15th birthday, the princess slipped away from her attendants and wandered all throughout the palace. At last, she came to a tower which she had never seen before. Wondering what it contained, she climbed the stairs. From a room at the top of the tower came a curious humming noise, and the princess, wondering what it could be, pushed open the door and stepped inside. Inside the room sat an old woman, bent with age and working at a strangely shaped wheel. The princess was full of curiosity. "Excuse me, what is that funny-looking thing?" she asked the old woman. "It's a spinning wheel, princess," answered the old woman, who was none other than the wicked fairy in disguise. "It looks quite easy and fun. Can I please try to use it?" said the princess. "Certainly, my gracious lady," replied the wicked fairy, and the princess sat down and tried to turn the wheel. But no sooner did she lay her hand upon it than the spindle, which was enchanted, pricked her finger, and the princess fell back against a silk-covered couch, fast asleep. In an instant, a dark silence fell upon all those who were in the castle. The king fell asleep in the midst of his counselors, the queen with the ladies in waiting, the horses in the stable, the pigeons on the roof, the flies on the walls, and even the fire in the fireplace fell asleep. The meat, which was cooking in the kitchen, ceased to sizzle, and the butler, who was tasting ale, fell asleep with the jug at his lips. A great hedge sprang up around the castle, which, as the years passed by, grew and grew, until it formed an impenetrable barrier around the sleeping palace. The old people in the kingdom died, and their children grew up and died also, and their children, and their children. And the story of the sleeping princess became a legend, handed down from one generation to another, and a cloud of mystery, as thick and as impenetrable as the hedge of thorns, lay over the old castle. Over the years, many brave princes tried to force their way through the magic hedge in order to solve the mystery and see for themselves the beautiful princess who was sleeping behind the thorny barrier. But the thorns caught them and prevented them from going forwards or backwards, and the brave princes perished miserably in the thickets. After many, many years, there came a prince into that kingdom, and he made up his mind to try and force his way to the castle to awaken the sleeping princess. People warned him about the fate of the other princes who also attempted this difficult task, but the prince was very determined. "I have made up my mind to see this princess of whose beauty I have heard so many wonderful tales," he declared. "I will force my way through the hedge of thorns and awaken the sleeping beauty, or die in the attempt." Now it happened that this day was the last day of the 100 years. So when the prince came to the thicket that surrounded the castle and began to push his way through, he found that the barrier yielded readily to his touch, and the thorns had all blossomed into roses that filled the air with fragrance. And the birds suddenly broke into singing, as if to tell the world that the 100 years of enchantment were over, and that the princess was about to be awakened from her long sleep. The prince passed through the council chamber where the king and his counselors were sleeping, then through the room where the queen and her ladies slept. He passed on from hall to hall and climbed from stair to stair until at last he reached the tower chamber where the sleeping princess lay. For a moment, the prince stood and gazed in wonder at the beautiful face of the sleeping princess. Then he sank on his knees beside her and kissed her as she lay asleep. Instantly, the spell was broken. The king and queen awoke, and all the courtiers with them. The horses in the stables awoke as well, and shook their glossy manes. The pigeons crowed on the roof, and the flies on the wall began to move again. The fire burned brightly in the fireplace, and the meat in the kitchen began to sizzle once more. Everything and everybody went on just as usual, as if nothing out of the ordinary ever occurred. And up in the tower chamber, the princess opened her eyes to meet the gaze of the prince, who had risked his life to save hers. Exactly what they said to each other, nobody quite knows, for nobody was there to hear or see. But whatever it was, it must have been something very wonderful, because very soon afterwards, the princess and the prince were married, and they lived happily ever after.